Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for being here. My name is Lori Forcier. I'm the Chief of Staff and Director of Partnerships for Educate Ventures Research. We're going to talk today, as we said, about using artificial intelligence to see the bigger picture and student data. And what we're going to do today is tell you a story about the relationship that we've built between ASU and Educate Ventures. And I'm really excited about this particular story. We talk a lot about the promise of AI in education. But when I get to talk to people about this story, it's how it's actually happening right now. So first I want to introduce my fellow panelists. We've got Julie Greenwood, who is the Vice Dean for Educational Initiatives and Professor at Arizona State University. My colleague from Educate Ventures, Ben DeBoule, who is our Chief Research Advisor and also an Emeritus Professor at Sussex. And at the end, we have Tom Fikes, who's the Director of Research at the Ed Plus Alliance Action Lab. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so let's dive in. First off, let's talk about the relationship between Educate Ventures and ASU. And I think this is important because here we have a large, innovative research university and a very small, slightly scrappy UK startup working together. So, how did that come to be? Tell us about that, and why has that partnership worked?
So, great story, really. And I think it's important to start by emphasizing, at ASU, partnerships are a priority, a presidential priority, and really drive the innovation that happens at the university, particularly in digital learning. And so the Action Lab, which Tom and I represent, is a research and development unit within Ed Plus at ASU, which is responsible for the administration of ASU Online and digital innovation. So Rose Luckin, the director of Educate, was on the advisory council for the Action Lab back in 2019 when the provost and the dean charged us really to explore whether or not our students across all modalities are really accomplishing or mastering the articulated learning outcomes of all of our programs. And then really, I think the dean focused in on, are they developing the unalterables of what all universities should be offering? And particularly, are our students learning to learn? And so this was the charge, and he expanded that charge to understand what does each modality do best, and then how can we use that information to improve learning across all modalities? And so the Action Lab, with ASU having over 150,000 students, the Action Lab has a wealth of research and data sets, and we needed a way to analyze that and Educate, with its expertise in artificial intelligence, allowed us an efficient way to approach that problem and gain that understanding. And so we came together into that partnership, and it has continued to flourish. And I will say, AHEAD has helped us to gain some momentum this last several days.
Yeah. And from the point of view of Educate Ventures, of course, this was so exciting. We were so keen to dig into student data around things that weren't just about content, but getting at these more complex learning phenomena, like metacognition, like learning how to learn. So to have an organization like ASU open the doors and say, yes, come work alongside us, and let's dig into this together, was a really, really exciting opportunity for us. So let's turn it over to, how did you go about something like measuring learning how to learn? I'm going to turn it over to Tom to tell us a little bit about that measurement.
Great. So institutional data, university data in the United States, and I'm sure it's the same here and most other places, has been optimized for two things: administration and for the business model. That's just by necessity. That's how things work. The registrar needs data. What it hasn't been optimized for is student learning. we have an increasingly growing body of really interesting data, but it's difficult to mine. So what we did in this partnership, working with Ben and Lori and their colleagues at Educate Ventures, was to try to leverage some of the AI tools to merge that data, to clean it, to transform it, so that we could find a signal in there about learning to learn. I'm going to let Ben say a little bit more about that in terms of the ontology that they developed, but I will say that from our perspective, as a social science researcher myself, I'm well familiar with operational definitions of data. That's my bread and butter. I'm not familiar with how to do that at the massive scale that is beyond just a human looking at a variable and saying, I think I'll define it this way. So the ontology was something that we learned about, the ontological method that artificial intelligence researchers use, something very interesting. So Ben, tell us about the ontology.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. So our job was to try to find a bridge between the very high-level notion of learning to learn and the actual data in the learning management system and the student information system, so that we could use that data to answer questions about learning to learn. And we started by doing a literature review and building an ontology, which is essentially a description of what learning to learning means. It has many, many components. And you're not supposed to be able to read any of the left-hand side of the screen, because those are some of the very many components that make up the ontology of whose the root node is learning to learn. A simplified version of what we did is on the right-hand half of the screen, and that shows the data that we had available in the learning management system and the student information system. We've got learning to learn at the top, and there were some 8 key notions that were going to form the bridge: engagement, feedback, reflection, practice, assessment, motivation, analysis, and review. And we built some rules which would allow us to look at the data at the bottom of that diagram and to see how they related to those 8 different factors. And those were 8 factors themselves, how they related to learning to learn. Of course, the data at the bottom has stuff that was of no consequence for learning to learn. Let's say institutional data or the student's fee status. And likewise, learning to learn has got factors that we couldn't find in the student data or in the learning to management data. That shows in the kind of the yellowy arrows going into learning to learn at the top there. So we built the bridge through 8 factors, and that's the crucial thing.
Okay, tell me a little bit more about some of the methods that you used. I know cluster analysis was part of this, and a process mining process was part of this. So what emerged from those analyses?
Great, I'll take the first stab at this and let Ben walk us down into some of the details. Focusing on the results, what did we find? I think one of the most actionable and interesting findings, actionable in the sense of being able to increase learning to learn in our students generally, and particularly into the underserved and more vulnerable populations. Julie will talk a little bit more about that shortly. But I think one of the interesting things that had emerged, and to some extent counterintuitive, was the clusters that came out of this very rich high-dimensional data set. Ben can say a little bit about the methods that they used, but from an end-user standpoint, 3 clusters of our students from these 2 introductory classes that emerged. One, and if we look at this along 2 of the 3 dimensions, achievement, so how well did they do in the course on the vertical axis, and effort or activity, how behaviorally engaged were they in the LMS. What we see is the 3 clusters. 6% of the students, fairly high grades, also high learning to learn, but interestingly low activity. So these were not particularly behaviorally engaged students. We don't know how socially and emotionally engaged they were, but in terms of their behavioral engagement, relatively low. High achieving and high learning to learn evidence. These are our efficient achievers. By the way, if anybody does factor analysis and cluster analysis, you know that naming the clusters is a bit of witchcraft. So Ben is going to say a little bit more about what we know beyond just the names here. But I'll use the name efficient achievers for that top 6%. At the other end of the achievement spectrum, the very low learning to learn evidence, low activity, and low achievement. I think we all know what it's like to have these students in our courses. They need to be motivated. They're struggling, but they're not really doing a lot on that. 27%. This is an enormous opportunity to find students that we can get engaged and help them to learn how to learn and to achieve. The middle, 67%, I think is perhaps the easiest for us to mine actionably and figure out how to intervene. That's the 67% of the students that showed modest learning to learn, so they're showing some evidence there. Very high activity, lots of clicks in the LMS, and low to modest achievement. Referred to these as high activity students, but I think it's important to note that that activity is not necessarily paying off for them in the way that they would hope that it would. One of the things I'd like to know in the future is not just the behavioral engagement, but how socially and emotionally engaged these students are, and is that a lever that we can pull to move them beyond? I'm going to turn it over to Ben to talk a little bit more about how we can extract some of the actionability, some of the process mining work that they do. But feel free to say more about clusters.
Yeah, I will. So the clusters here show, in part, the amount of evidence that we could find for a student exhibiting activities which contribute to learning to learn. And we thought about learning to learn as essentially a change in self-regulated learning, okay, an improvement rather than a deficit. So the clusters here are built on the amount of evidence for learning to learn. But that doesn't really tell you what the students were doing in terms of the sequence of activities. We've got the totality of what they did, but not the sequence of what they did. So we use process mining to have a look at how the different, if you remember those 8 categories that we were funneling all the data through, we use process mining to see what kinds of activities within those 8 categories followed one from another. And I'm not going to go into the details, but what we have here are 3 graphs, one for each of the clusters that we'd identified. And you can see at least the shapes of the graphs are really quite different. So the behavior of the apparently not very energetic but high achieving, high LTL people is very different from the behavior of the not very good at LTL, not very good at anything people, and is different again from the people who were beavering away, working really, really hard, but not actually achieving very much, and middling LTL. And we can actually see that when we look at the sequence of behaviors between achievement and engagement and assessment, etc.
Fantastic. And I'm going to take us back 2 slides so that you can see those 8 dimensions that Ben was just referring to. Again, we're looking at the engagement, the behavioral engagement, feedback that the students were receiving, reflection that the students were doing on their own assignments and assessments, the practice that the students were putting in, the assessments on those, student motivation, analysis, and review.
Right. Move along. Thank you so much. So lots of interesting findings here. A few from my perspective. One, just looking at some of the charts that Tom and Ben were just showing us, you start to see where you might start to get an understanding about where to intervene, for example, in a way that you might not have otherwise. But perhaps one of the most interesting findings that has come out of this is that learning how to learn can be treated as a dimension in its own right, separate from something like student engagement, separate from achievement as we've construed it traditionally, and that has lots of implications. But I want to hear from Julie about what she thinks, are some of the most interesting and then important findings out of this work.
Great. Yeah. So certainly to amplify that, I think we see learning to learn as a fundamental skill for 21st century learners. And so certainly as that conversation around the importance of skills development within higher education continues, we see this as a way to guide and drive that forward. But certainly one of the charges from the provost and the dean was to look across the different modalities to understand what was happening in those different course offerings. And so what you can see here are three of those course offerings, and I'll spend a little bit of time talking about the nuance between what's happening in each of these. So the online, so the first graph there refers to our fully online students. And so these are non-traditional learners in degree programs that are around the world accessing ASU education. The face-to-face is your traditional campus-based students. And so those are students going to a physical classroom and having a traditional lecture. And you'll notice just looking at those two, it's the same faculty, same learning outcomes, leveraging the same content, and these will result in the same degree. And these are courses that are in our two largest and fastest growing programs, both campus and online. So this is biological sciences and psychology. But the I course, so the I course is a fully online course that is offered to our campus-based students. And so once again, you'll notice those are the students that are accessing, just like the online students, everything is happening within that online digital learning environment. However, they're still living on campus or just off campus. They still have access to the physical space and the physical opportunities in the social environment. And you'll notice that learning to learn ability is higher for those students. Those are also students that fit the more traditional experience that we all know for campus-based higher education experiences.
Okay, great. So not much difference between online and face-to-face, a statistically significant difference for those who are enrolled in the I-course version of these courses. So what do you think was the most important finding from your point of view?
Well, I certainly think we discovered this opportunity to really focus on development of more equitable learning within ASU and really across higher education. And so when we looked at the data, and Tom and Ben can elaborate on this, but our underserved students, and so this is typically students low income or students from historically disadvantaged racial backgrounds, had lower experiences or lower learning to learn representation, and that was activity assessment and practice. And so once again, this actually, we had a very rich discussion yesterday as we were prepping for this around what are we doing wrong, right? So frequently, our tendency is to say, well, what's wrong with the students?
Right.
But it's really, what are we doing wrong, and what do we need to do to change about our system? And I think a big part of what we've learned is that maybe we need to change the way we're doing assessment. I think our traditional assessment systems really favor privileged students from those more traditional backgrounds. And yet many of our students are, particularly in ASU Online, are non-traditional. We have single parents. They're working two jobs. So they have many skills and assets that they bring into those courses and into the university that aren't recognized, by our traditional assessment mechanism. So this really opens up a wealth of opportunities for us, really as we're driving this forward, really as we're trying to understand what is needed to advance our educational system, to develop that fundamental skill of the ability to be able to learn or learning to learn. And so, Tom, did you want to elaborate more on some of those specific activity assessment and practice?
Yeah, I think I'd like to get you to engage a little bit on, as we list out these 3 bullets where we saw the gaps. Now, gaps are important. We want to be able to identify those gaps, but I think it's a very easy slide from the language of gaps into the mindset of a deficit model. As Julie said, a problem with the student that they need to remedy, or as a faculty member myself, often thinking the schools that come before need to remedy this so I don't have to deal with it. But I'd like you to say a little word about how we take that from a conceptual or from a mindset standpoint. How do you take the observation that there is an activity gap, that there is an achievement or an assessment gap, that there's a gap in their learning to learn evidence around practice? How do we take that and reconstrue that as an asset model? How do we take that equity lens that we're looking at with our data, turn it around and look at ourselves and what we did over this last year and a half or so with the Learning to Learn project? Any thoughts that you have on that, Julie or Ben or Laurie?
Did you want to add?
I think one thought is that the underserved students will have come typically through situations which aren't measured and have skills that aren't part of academic learning to learn, but are probably very much part of life learning to learn. And so we can maybe capitalize on their extra street wisdom, for example, in doing things that we wouldn't otherwise do with them.
I mean, what I think I'm hearing come out is, this turning of the lens is, how do we reassess now based on what we're starting to learn from studies like this, how we assess what it means to be successful in a higher education setting, or what it means to achieve, and what are the factors that we want to measure. I mean, I think I would make the argument that learning how to learn is certainly one of them, and a very transferable skill that we'd love to be able to capture on an ongoing basis. But what are the other sorts of skills that we might want to be capturing or bringing into that assessment of progress, that understanding as well, and saying, what, actually we really value this, and now we have an opportunity to be able to see it a little bit better as well. So, given all of that, and this is a blank slide because we're also opening this up to all of you as well. What do you think? What other analytic tools do universities need? Like, what needs to happen next to capitalize on what's been learned in this project so far?
Well, certainly, I think we need to evolve our ontology, evolve our methodology, to have really shape and guide a more equitable education, more equitable assessment mechanisms within higher education. And I think it's not only collecting different data, but also changing the data that we're creating. And then once again, that gets back to changing those assessments, creating an assessment system and a higher education system that recognizes the assets, as we've discussed, of our underserved students. And so I think of teamwork, for example. This is one of the skills we emphasize at ASU. We have a partnership with Starbucks. Many of our Starbucks students work in an environment, and they have outstanding teamwork skills coming into ASU Online. And once again, we're not recognizing or giving them the opportunity to demonstrate that within our current assessment systems. Assessment systems are still structured to focus on that traditional campus-based students. I think you can carry that forward to, we have a very large military students and veteran students who also come in with unique skill sets that our system does not recognize. And I certainly say that as my son is recently enlisted in the Army, I'm hearing from him about what he's doing and what he's experiencing. And it's a very different skill set than what he learned when he graduated from ASU Online in the fall. So I'd love to hear different perspectives.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say, Ben and Tom, and if you have any thoughts also about what this could possibly mean for the practical, lived experience of being, a faculty member. How could, these kinds of changes that we're talking about, that Julie's talking about, change how people are approaching their teaching and learning?
So a really important part of this project that we haven't really focused on here, the methodology, was engaging the faculty. We talk a lot about engaging students, and that's obviously very important, but a mechanism toward that is to engage the faculty. So Educate came in and ran a series of workshops with our faculty through both of these pilot programs, and bringing those faculty in, not just to tell them what we were going to do, but to find out where do they have data that could perhaps bear on learning to learn, and maybe most importantly, how do they conceive of learning to learn, and how does that conception emerge through the workshops that we did? I think, to pivot back to something that Julie said around our Starbucks and military students, there may be for many of us a conceptual firewall between something like learning to learn, which sounds a little bit cognitive and academic, and something like team and collaboration, which can sound a little bit more social emotional, a little bit more fuzzy. But I think as we move firmly into the second quarter of the 21st century, we're seeing that collaboration is a critical component of learning. So learning to learn, not just in the university, but in the corporate world, real life that they're going to move into beyond, involves that kind of collaboration in order to learn the new things. Most of our students, the recent study in the United States suggested that our graduates coming out now will change careers, not jobs, but careers 7 times over the course of their life. You can't come back to the university for a new degree every couple of years to do that. So learning to learn, learning how to pivot, and learning how to leverage your collaborators, your team, to be able to do that, an important 21st century skill.
If a university is going to treat learning to learn as one of its objectives for the students, it needs to be center stage. They may be learning biology, or they may be learning psychology, or they may be learning geography, but they're also learning to learn. And to help them do that, they need to know how am I doing on my learning to learn? I learned lots of learning skills at school. Are they any better? Are they any worse? We need to use some of the data that we've shown you on the slides and some of those diagrams to feed back to individual students saying, look, here's your behavior. This is how a really good student is behaving. There are bits missing in what you do, or there are bits extra that we need to work on. Likewise for the staff, if they can see how their students are doing in terms of those process mining graphs, or in terms of those clusters, they can say, okay, this person is clearly in that top cluster, not putting in huge amounts of effort, but achieving everything. Let's really challenge those students. The ones who are working really hard, but not achieving very much, you need a different kind of action plan. But you can't apply the action plan unless you know which cluster the student is in. So my 2 pennyworth is, we need to have this kind of data, dashboards for students so they can see how they're doing, dashboards for staff so they can see how they should be doing, and dashboards for university administrators so they can see how is the university doing. So that the provost can then stand up, hand on heart, and say, our students are learning to learn, because we've got the data to show it.
Great. And I can see time is ticking down. We've got about 43 seconds left. And the work continues. This was just the first piece of work that we're doing, and this is a little bit of a joke, but what do we need from you? We're glad to have you here. We want your questions. We want your engagement. If any of you have access to funding and you're interested in this work, we would be very happy to chat with you as well. But thank you from myself, from Educate Ventures, from Arizona State, and all of my panelists. We'll be here for a few minutes afterwards if anyone would like to talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.